At dawn, the sky over the Pacific was a pale, gray curtain, the kind that hides the horizon and makes every sound feel closer than it should. Inside the narrow cockpit of a TBF Avenger, a young pilot pulled his harness tight and glanced at the torpedo suspended beneath him. It was a Mark 13 torpedo, a weapon he had been trained to trust, yet one he knew might fail him when he needed it most. The engine's slow rumble vibrated through the frame, steady but heavy, as if the aircraft itself understood the weight of what was coming. Down below, waves rolled like sheets of dark steel. In those moments before takeoff, every pilot in the squadron understood the same quiet truth. Courage could carry a man through enemy fire, but it could not make a faulty weapon explode. And still they launched, because that was their duty. What none of them could know then was that the very aircraft they were flying, the TBF Avenger, would one day be remembered as the best torpedo bomber of World War II. Torpedo. But first, it would require a reckoning with failure, a battle not fought in the sky but in the shadows of a broken system. What really happened to turn a flawed weapon into one of the most decisive tools of the Pacific War? The war in the Pacific did not wait for perfection. When the TBF Avenger first entered combat, it carried with it all the promise of American engineering: a powerful radial engine long range, a sturdy frame meant to survive punishment that would tear lesser aircraft apart. On paper, it was everything a modern torpedo bomber needed to be. But beneath its bomb bay hung a weapon that belonged to an earlier age: the Mark 13 torpedo. The Avenger's essential strike arm had been designed when aircraft flew slower, lower, and under far less pressure. By 1942, those assumptions were dangerously outdated. The requirements for using a Mark 13 torpedo bordered on suicidal. Pilots were expected to fly straight and level at barely 130 miles per hour at altitude so low that a moment's hesitation could put their wingtips into the sea. They had to release at a precise distance and then continue on the same course long enough for enemy gunners to lock on and fire. Every deviation increased the chance that the torpedo would veer off dive too deep, strike the water incorrectly, or simply fail to arm. And even when dropped perfectly, the weapon often betrayed its crew. Yet the United States Navy had no alternative. Newport's torpedo station held a monopoly over torpedo design and production, and with congressional protection behind it, little changed. The flaws were known. Reports from training exercise revealed catastrophic failure rates. But the findings were buried, labeled confidential, or dismissed as pilot error. Then came the first real test, the opening battles of 1942. At Coral Sea at Midway and across the early months of the Pacific War, squadron after squadron launched their TBF Avengers with the same grim determination. They flew into carriers ringed with anti-aircraft fire, only to watch their Mark 13 torpedoes strike holes without exploding, curve away in wide arcs, or sink harmlessly before reaching their target. The aircraft performed, the men performed, the weapon did not. Midway exposed this truth in the starkest terms. Young crews, many barely out of training, pressed into their attack runs knowing their torpedoes might never function. Most never returned. Those who did brought back stories that shook the confidence of the entire torpedo community. The Avenger could handle punishment, could endure fire, could bring its pilots home with holes in every surface. But the Mark 13 torpedo it carried made each mission a gamble with impossible odds. Still, the TBF Avenger was not yet finished. Beneath the heartbreak of those early failures lay the seeds of something greater, though no one at the time could see how. The aircraft that would someday be called the best torpedo bomber of World War II was still waiting for the weapon it deserved. By late 1942, the grim truth surrounding the Mark 13 torpedo could no longer be ignored. Torpedo squadrons had flown through the worst the Japanese Navy could throw at them, only to see their weapons falter at the moment of decision. Letters from the front, heavily censored, hinted at a despair no training manual had prepared them for. Pilots spoke of perfect attack runs, ending in silence of torpedoes striking enemy ships without detonating of friends lost to missions that felt less like combat and more like sacrifice. The turning point, however, did not begin in a Navy bureau or inside a weapons laboratory. It began on the concrete face of a dam in California, far from any battlefield. In early 1943, the National Defense Research Committee brought in a Caltech physicist named Charles Lauritsen to examine the torpedo problem. Lauritsen did not come from naval tradition. He came from physics, from the strict logic of hydrodynamics and impact forces. And when his team began high-speed filming of torpedoes striking water at Morris Dam, they uncovered what pilots had suspected for months. Almost everything the Navy believed about torpedo drops was wrong. The footage showed Mark 13 torpedoes tumbling in midair, slapping the water at disastrous angles, crushing internal mechanisms upon impact. Even the TBF Avenger, with all its rugged engineering, could not compensate for a weapon that was fundamentally unstable in flight. If the aircraft was ever to earn the title Best Torpedo Bomber of World War II, the torpedo itself had to be reinvented. Lauritsen's team experimented relentlessly. They studied the Japanese Type 91 torpedo and its wooden stabilizing boxes. They tested fins, parachutes, and drag plates, each revealing new insights and new limitations. The breakthrough finally came in two deceptively simple ideas: a lightweight aluminum ring fitted around the tail and a plywood collar mounted around the nose. The ring, what pilots later called the shroud, ring stabilized the Mark 13 torpedo during its fall and protected its delicate control surfaces. The nose collar, mockingly nicknamed the pickle barrel, slowed the torpedo, just enough to ensure the correct entry angle at high speeds. Together, they transformed the weapon's behavior. Test after test showed the same remarkable pattern: smooth water entry, straight underwater travel, reliable arming, and consistent detonation. For the first time, the TBF Avenger carried a torpedo that worked the way it should. But this new weapon was not yet official. The Bureau of Ordnance resisted questioning the modifications and the authority behind them. That did not stop the fleet. Squadron mechanics desperate to save their pilots quietly traveled to California to learn how to install the modifications themselves. Under dim workshop lights, they drilled, bolted, and measured until they could prepare a torpedo in minutes. They returned to their carriers with unofficial drawings, tucked into their tool bags diagrams that would soon change the Pacific War. As 1944 approached, the transformation was ready to begin. The TBF Avenger was finally armed with the Mark 13 torpedo, worthy of the aircraft that carried it. And the battles ahead would reveal just how powerful this union could be. The first true test of the modified Mark 13 torpedo came on June 19, 1944, during the Battle of the Philippine Sea. 8 Avengers from Task Force 58 rolled into their attack runs, dropping their torpedoes not from the old deadly altitudes of 100 feet, but from more than 600. What followed was something no American pilot had ever witnessed before. The torpedoes entered the water cleanly, almost silently, and began running straight toward the Japanese carrier Hiyo. 3 of them struck home. All 3 exploded. Within hours, Hiyo was gone. Word spread faster than doctrine could contain it. By nightfall, mechanics across the task force were fitting shroud rings and pickle barrel collars onto every Mark 13 torpedo they could reach. Before dawn, every TBF Avenger in the fleet carried the modified weapon. And for the first time since the start of the Pacific War, torpedo pilots launched without the quiet dread of wondering whether their weapon would fail them. The results were immediate and devastating. During the Battle of Leyte Gulf in October 1944, the Japanese super battleship Musashi One, of the largest warships ever built, was struck again and again by modified Mark 13 torpedoes. Avengers approached from angles and altitudes once considered impossible. Wave after wave sent torpedoes slicing into the sea, each one running with the steady, unwavering motion pilots would later describe as a train on rails. 19 torpedoes found their target. Everyone that hit exploded. Musashi rolled and sank beneath the waves, taking more than 1,000 men with her. The next day, more Avengers, now confident in both aircraft and weapon, went after Yamato and her escorts. Torpedoes dropped from high-angle dives entered the ocean, with barely a ripple tracking toward their targets with lethal precision. The effect on the Japanese fleet was immediate. Panic formations broke apart. Gunners lost coordination, and ships that once shrugged off American torpedoes now feared them. The psychological shift alone changed the rhythm of the Pacific War. But the newfound power came at a price measured in memories, not machinery. The men who had flown earlier missions, those who had watched their torpedoes fail, or had died attempting textbook runs, never saw this turning point. Their loss haunted the survivors. Many pilots later spoke of the relief they felt in 1944, but also the anger that lingered, the knowledge that so many comrades had been lost because a broken system refused to confront its own failures. Still, by late 1944, the transformation was beyond dispute. A TBF Avenger, armed with a properly modified Mark 13 torpedo, had become the best torpedo bomber of World War II. Not because the aircraft itself had changed, but because the weapon finally matched the courage of the men who carried it. The remarkable turnaround of the Mark 13 torpedo did not erase what came before it. Within the United States Navy, the success of the modified weapon cast an uncomfortable light on the decisions that had allowed so many failures to continue unchecked. For years, senior officers had attributed poor performance to pilot error, faulty tactics, or the chaos of battle. The truth revealed at Morris Dam showed otherwise the weapon itself had been inadequate, and the system responsible for fielding it had failed the men who depended on it. That recognition created a quiet divide inside the Navy. Officers in the fleet who had witnessed the deadly consequences firsthand saw the modified torpedo as validation, proof that their pilots had never been the problem. Bureau officials in Washington, however, reacted with defensiveness. Reports issued after the war credited ongoing refinement for the torpedoes, improved performance downplaying the role of Caltech and ignoring the unauthorized modifications made by frontline mechanics. It was institutional history written to protect institutional pride. Outside the United States, the reaction was very different. Japanese commanders were stunned by the sudden leap in American torpedo effectiveness. At the start of the Pacific War, they had considered the Mark 13 torpedo a minor threat, unreliable, and poorly engineered. By late 1944, they viewed it with something close to dread. After-action reports described the TBF Avenger as a menacing aircraft that could strike from any altitude at speeds once thought incompatible with torpedo attacks. The psychological effect was profound. Where Japanese ships had once maneuvered confidently during torpedo runs, they now scattered in fear of weapons that seemed impossibly accurate. The strategic implications were equally significant. The reliable Mark 13 torpedo allowed the United States Navy to conduct wide-reaching multi-angle attacks that overwhelmed even Japan's largest formations. This shift accelerated the collapse of Japan's surface fleet and reshaped the final year of the Pacific War. It also influenced post-war procurement standards, independent testing, diversified contractors, and greater accountability became standard practice in American weapons development. Yet the deepest lesson was not technical, it was human. The rise of the TBF Avenger as the best torpedo bomber of World War II was not the result of a flawless system, but of individuals who refused to accept deadly flaws. Pilots demanded answers, mechanics defied regulations, scientists challenged assumptions. Their efforts saved lives, shortened battles, and restored faith in a weapon that had once been a symbol of failure. In the end, the story of the TBF Avenger is not simply the story of an aircraft. It is a story of what happens when human courage outpaces the tools it is given, and what can happen when people choose to fix what institutions ignore. The Avenger had always possessed the strength, range, and resilience to serve as the backbone of American carrier aviation. But it did not become the best torpedo bomber of World War II until the Mark 13 torpedo was finally transformed into the weapon its pilots had always needed. That transformation came not from official directives, but from a handful of scientists who questioned the impossible, from mechanics who worked through the night drilling holes in metal they had no authorization to touch, and from squadron leaders who believed saving their men mattered more than following regulations. Their efforts reshaped the Pacific War. More importantly, they restored trust that a pilot's bravery would not be wasted. Trust that the weapon beneath the wings of a TBF Avenger would strike true trust that sacrifice would finally have meaning. When the modified Mark 13 torpedo began to run hot, straight, and normal, it carried more than explosives. It carried the memory of every crew lost in 1942 and 1943, every failed run, every letter home that never arrived. Each successful hit in 1944 was in a quiet way an act of vindication for those who never saw the turning point. Today, restored Avengers fly at air shows across the United States. Their broad wings and distinctive engine rumble draw crowds, yet few onlookers know the full story behind their wartime legacy. They see an aircraft, but beneath its skin lives a reminder that progress in war is rarely clean. It is often born from frustration from loss, and from the determination of individuals who refuse to accept that good enough is good enough. As you think about this history, consider the weapons and systems used by modern service members. Somewhere someone may be carrying equipment that isn't ready, just as those early pilots carried the flawed Mark 13 torpedo. And somewhere else, someone may be fighting to fix it. What lesson stands out to you most from the story of the TBF Avenger? If you have thoughts, share them below. We read every comment. And if you want to continue exploring how moments like these shape the world we live in, consider subscribing for the next chapter of our military history journey.